Hey guys, I'm Heidi Priebe. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if this is your first time here. Today we are talking about boundaries and how to tell if yours have become too rigid. Now I want to be clear before we get started that when I say the term too rigid, this does not mean that there are objective types of boundaries that are inherently too rigid or not rigid enough. Boundaries need to be adjusted based on the relationship that they pertain to. So two people could set the exact same boundary with two different people in their lives, and for one person, the boundary could be absolutely perfect and completely appropriate to the situation, whereas for another person, the exact same boundary could actually be way too lenient or not at all appropriate to the situation. So as we go through this video, what I want you to keep in mind is that these are things you need to check in with yourself about. The appropriate boundary to set is always the boundary that allows you to stay the most present and alive and engaged with your own life. So boundaries are not about keeping people or things out predominantly. They are about keeping our full selves intact within. So you know that your boundaries have become too rigid when they are impeding upon your ability to express yourself authentically and show up in a genuine way in the world. The first sign that this is happening for you is that your boundaries are leading you to feel kind of dead inside. So I'm going to say this again because I cannot emphasize it enough. The point of boundaries is not to keep things out. It is to define which limits we need to set in order to keep ourselves feeling present, vital, and relatively safe within. A very kind of common rookie mistake I see people making when they start setting boundaries for the first time is leaving everything that excites them, that interests them, and that they want out of their life on the other side of their boundaries. So when we set a healthy boundary that actually works for us, it's about conserving energy in one area so that we can use it in an area that's more important to us. Boundaries that are too rigid cut you off from the risk of spontaneously feeling things. But healthy boundaries increase your ability to stay present and experience your emotions as they spontaneously arrive. So I'm going to give you an example of this. There was once a situation where I was meant to go see a friend who I had to drive out of town in order to visit. And I had two trips planned with this friend. One was I was going to go visit them this weekend, and then they were going to come down to my city for another event that was happening the next weekend. The weekend that I was meant to go visit them, there was an incredible snowstorm that hit the highway in between where I was and where they were. And I knew I do not feel safe driving in this weather. I don't want to get on that highway. I don't want to risk it. It feels too intimidating to me to be out in that storm. But my friend, I could tell, was really hoping that I would make it that weekend, which was fair because we had plans that we were both very genuinely excited for. But a part of me knew if I get on that highway, even if everything goes smoothly, even if I make it through the storm, even if I white knuckle it the whole way there and then arrive safe and sound, I am going to feel a sense of resentment because I will know the whole time I don't want to get in this car. I don't want to drive there. I want to keep myself safe at home, and I'm a little bit annoyed with the fact that the only reason I'm getting in this car and going to see my friend is because I know that they really want me to come. And I really thought about it, and I thought, if I go and I bring that resentment with me, we're going to have a really weird weekend. I'm going to be a bit annoyed the whole time. I'm going to tell myself this story. They don't really care about me. They're not concerned about my well-being. And it's going to really impact my ability to be present with this friend. So I made the decision to not get in the car and go to my friend's house. And the next weekend, when they came down to my city, once the storm had cleared up, we were able to reunite and have a really wonderful couple of days together because there was no lingering tensions, there was no underlying resentments. And so my decision the weekend before to respect my own limitations and set a boundary, even though I knew that it was not quite what my friend was hoping for, allowed us to stay in connection in a very authentic and genuine way. Because the next time we saw each other, there was nothing under the surface that was keeping us from actually being in the moment with each other. And this is exactly what healthy boundaries are supposed to help us do. to get rid of the things that would otherwise turn into a lingering resentment, simmering anger that runs under the surface of a relationship, some sort of story we're telling ourselves about the other person or ourselves that gets in the way of us being able to just sit with them and be totally open to whatever emotions are arising in the moment because we're not preoccupying ourselves with unresolved things from the past. So this brings us back to that point. If your boundaries are causing you to feel kind of dead inside, like there's no joy or excitement or aliveness inside of your relationships, it's very probable that your boundaries have become too rigid. Boundaries can be sad, they can be difficult to set, but they shouldn't make us feel as though we have nowhere to move and nowhere to go, right? Boundaries are supposed to be the things that expand our ability to move freely in the world without resentments. Which brings us to sign number 2, that your boundaries might be too rigid. You are constantly going back on your own boundaries or failing to reinforce them after you set them. Now, why on earth would we consistently go back on a boundary that we ourselves decided was important to set? Probably because the boundary that we set wasn't nuanced enough. So it included both parts of the relationship that we do truly want to do away with, but also parts that we want to keep. So I think that this is a very common dynamic that happens, for example, with couples who keep breaking up and getting back together and breaking up and getting back together. It is this idea of throwing the baby out with the bathwater when you set boundaries. So because you haven't taken the time to really sit down, be present with what is and isn't working in your relationship, and then separate those things out so it's clear, you are assuming that if anything goes wrong, you need to throw the entire relationship out, or you have to throw a very significant portion of it out. And if you are throwing out what's good alongside with what's bad in a relationship, you're probably going to find yourself repeatedly crossing your own boundary, deciding not to reinforce your own boundary because you think that to get the good back, you have to also welcome in the bad. This often happens when we don't want to face what it is that we actually don't like about a relationship, or when we aren't really aware of the fact that we can set real, nuanced boundaries. Or there could be some fundamental part of the repair process after we've had a rupture in our relationship that we are consistently missing out on. So this is a bit embarrassing, but an example from my own life is that I used to not really know what it meant to be vulnerable. I would feel angry at someone, and when I got angry, whether it was a close friend, a family member, a partner, I would simply take a bunch of space and expect that eventually that feeling of anger would pass. And then when it did, I would go back into the relationship as though nothing had happened. What was missing from this process was me sitting with that anger, learning where I had actually been hurt in the interaction, bringing that part forward to the person who had hurt me, talking to them about it, and figuring out what we could do differently next time so that when we were in a similar situation, we could navigate it without unnecessary hurt feelings. And because I didn't know how to do that, I didn't know how to access my own vulnerability, I didn't know how to put language to it, and I definitely did not know how to share that language with another human being, what I would end up doing is taking space when I was angry, and then sometimes, especially in situations where there were reasons why I needed to interact with that person on a daily basis, because let's say we work together or live together, I would end up going back on my own boundary of not wanting to be in touch for a certain period of time because I didn't really have a way around it. And so I would go back into the same harmful situation, never having set clear boundaries where I needed to set them, and find myself continuously frustrated that I was right back where I started. So this leads me to point number 3, which I essentially just gave you all of. So sign number 3 that your boundaries are too rigid is that you are more likely to cut someone out altogether than you are to explain to them directly what the problem is and try to work with them to resolve it. So again, this is one where, particularly if you grew up insecurely attached, you might not even be cognizant of the fact that there is another way to do things. You may have always learned you just stay in a relationship, you white knuckle your way through the things that you don't like or the things you feel hurt by, or the ways in which you have to numb yourself or distort your own persona in order to stay in close contact with the other person. And if you don't want to do any of that anymore, then you just exit the relationship. And it sounds so simple, and everyone tends to agree when you say things like relationships require communication, relationships require discomfort, relationships require a lot of work. But many of us who grew up with this unconscious programming that tells us we either ignore the things we don't like or we throw the entire relationship out, end up doing just that and operating directly from that programming. So it might not even occur to us that we could go up to someone and go, hey, here's what's not working for me. Here's where I felt hurt within something that you told me. Here's what I would like to do to try to resolve this. What do you think about working with me to see if we can approach this situation differently the next time it shows up? Boundaries are not supposed to protect us from feeling difficult or vulnerable emotions. They're only supposed to protect us from genuine, senseless harm, right? So if there are things happening inside of a relationship that involve, let's say, one person constantly projecting onto another in a way that cannot get resolved because the problem they have is really not with that person, it's with someone from their past, but it's easier to get mad at the person in front of them. That's the type of situation where it's not really helping anyone. And if you are the person on the receiving end of that, it's going to be helpful after a few tries to directly resolve it to simply set a boundary and go, okay, I have to reevaluate what this person's position should be in my life. If they are unwilling to take responsibility for the ways in which they are impacting me after I make that explicitly clear to them and try to resolve it directly with them if possible, then I have to look at, where do I draw a fence around this behavior? Where do I keep myself separate from it so that I can continue to move through the world with freedom and flexibility? But what boundaries are not there to do is to protect you from having to feel anything, right? You're going to have difficult situations that come up even in the most secure relationship. You're going to have ways that you piss each other off. You're going to have ways in which your lives don't combine super easily. And you're going to have to work together, whether it's in a romantic relationship, a friendship, any really close connection, to figure out which compromises both of you are willing to make. But if, before even considering proposing a compromise, you move immediately to throwing the entire relationship in the garbage, there is a very high chance that your boundaries are too rigid and that you may never have learned or really internalized, even if you did learn it, that there are a lot of steps you can take before throwing a relationship in the garbage. But they are definitely risky, vulnerable steps that you have to be ready to protect yourself through. And this might involve undoing a lot of the things you've internalized about what it means to be a good or ideal partner or friend or family member. If you are holding yourself up to these expectations that don't make sense relative to the relationship you're in, it's going to be really hard to set boundaries appropriately. Not to go off on too big of a tangent, but I think it's an important one. A lot of the time, I see people who are, let's say, severely insecurely attached dating another person who is severely insecurely attached, and they are trying to apply the norms that exist within a secure relationship to their relationship, and then getting distressed when it doesn't work out, not taking into account the fact that their relationship is not a secure relationship. Ergo, it is going to have different norms and different boundaries. What do I mean by that? I mean, there are kind of platitudes you hear about things like partners should be able to meet each other's emotional needs. However, if you are insecurely attached, let's say you are severely anxiously attached, and you have a lot of emotional needs that you do not have any ability or any understanding of how to meet on your own, like let's say day-to-day emotional regulation skills, and you are expecting your partner to be there for you and to fix the way you're feeling every single time you feel upset, that might be an unreasonable expectation to be placing on your partner because the level of emotional needs that you have is much, much higher than someone in a secure relationship. So you might need to figure out, how do I get support in other areas so I'm not putting all of these emotional needs that the average secure person grew up learning to meet for themselves on another person who is not my parent or my caregiver and is really not responsible for emotionally growing me up, right? So how do I take on that task for myself? How do I find a counselor? a support system, a group of peers who I can turn to for quite a bit of that when I'm feeling distressed and emotionally dysregulated, versus how much is my partner able and explicitly willing to take on. And there's certainly an equivalent example we could find from the avoidance side of things, but the point of all of this is just to make it clear that boundaries need to be relationship specific. What works for one relationship could be the completely and totally wrong set of boundaries for another. All right, tangent over. Sign number 4 that your boundaries are too rigid is that you most often set boundaries when you are angry or upset, and the main purpose for your boundaries is that you are trying to punish somebody else to get them to change their behavior. I wasn't even sure if I was going to include this on the list because at this point, you are not technically setting a boundary. Now, of course, we don't want people to treat us badly, right? But the purpose of setting a boundary is not to change somebody else's behavior. If we want someone to change the way they're behaving towards us, we can ask them directly. Hey, I noticed that you don't speak particularly kindly towards me. Or I don't like it when you say things like X, Y, or Z to me. Would you mind not saying that to me anymore? Because I find it really gets in the way of me being able to feel close to you if I feel as though you are speaking down to me. And when you say X, Y, or Z, I feel spoken down to. I feel kind of small and insignificant. If they say yes, great, then your relationship changes. If they say no, then the boundary that you set as a result is not to punish them and get them to change. It is to protect yourself from being in a situation where there's even a possibility that you are going to encounter that behavior in them. So if you think, I can't get through a conversation without this person speaking down to me, it is your job as your inner adult, whose job it is to protect your inner child, to make sure that in the future you have few to no conversations with that person again. A boundary is about how you will protect yourself, not about how you are trying to manipulate someone into protecting you for you. And I think that this type of behavior is not uncommon among anyone who is insecurely attached, is this pattern of kind of not saying anything about something that makes you uncomfortable in a relationship for a long period of time until the resentment grows and grows and grows, and then doing some sort of huge, intense protest behavior. So telling someone you want to break up with them, telling someone you are moving out, threatening to do something that will negatively impact the other person, and calling it a boundary. One more time for the cheap seats, it is not a boundary if the end goal is getting someone else's behavior to change. That is a manipulation, even if you have very good reason to be upset with the other person, right? Someone could be truly unkind, cruel, directly to my face, and I still get the choice about whether I'm going to set a boundary or attempt to manipulate them. I still have a choice about my own integrity in that situation. A boundary protects me. A manipulation puts both of us into the drama triangle and perpetuates the cycle of dysfunction. We're telling ourselves, I'll only be okay if this other person changes. And that is a completely external locus of control that robs us of any real autonomy. So it is definitely not the kind of flexible and self-responsible choice that allows us to move more freely in the world. If anything, it just creates more anxiety for us because we are now desperate for someone to behave in a way that we have no real control over. And sign number 5, that your boundaries have become too rigid. We have been hinting at this throughout the entire video. You are extremely all or nothing in relationships. So you have absolutely no boundaries at all. You are cruising down the freeway with no stop signs anywhere. And then all of a sudden you throw your car off the road and completely abandon the highway altogether. This is an extraordinarily common dynamic in insecurely attached dynamics in which both people did not really learn what a boundary is, how to recognize where and when they need to set them, and instead both parties learn you put up with whatever you get, and then when your frustration level or your anger level or the story that you've been creating in your head about how you're a victim and they're a villain gets to a certain threshold, you abandon the entire thing altogether and start afresh with another relationship that you go into with the same level of enmeshment. So in that same unboundaried way, that does not protect you in any real way from the parts of the relationship that do not work for you. So these are the signs to watch out for that you might not be the best at setting boundaries within your relationship, and that when you do, you set boundaries that are way too extreme for the situation at hand. But what we are going to talk about next in a follow-up video that is coming out later this week is how to recognize where you need to set boundaries. how to check in with yourself, probably for the first time, and learn what it is that keeps you present, engaged, flexible, and fully authentic within a relationship, as well as how can you go about setting those boundaries once you realize where they need to be, so that you no longer need to resort to these overly rigid, overly harsh boundaries that aren't really helping you get the types of relationships you want. But for now, that is all I'm going to say. As always, I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you back here again super soon.